Good morning, EAC Church family. It's so good to see you this morning and be with you in worship together. Our guest speaker this morning is Mr. Greg Koukl. Some of you know Greg and know of his ministry and teaching, but Greg is the founder and president of Stand to Reason Ministries, and they've been doing the work of the Lord for 32 years over a number of different places and times and events. They have a global reach, have worked all over the world, and their ministry is focused on Christianity in clear thinking and to bring the gospel of Jesus and to help make disciples around the world. Greg was with us all day yesterday for our fall forum. We had a wonderful time of his teaching and our learning, and it was such a blessing to have him here yesterday, and it is such a blessing to have him with us this morning. We've been blessed at EAC by using the materials of his organization and Greg's teaching for about 8 years now in our Discipleship Pathway program. And that has meant so much to us in terms of what we're able to accomplish for Jesus as we grow in his character and his competencies. So I'd like to ask you to give a warm EAC welcome to our guest this morning, Greg Koukl.
Thank you, Clark. Here, you can take this. Thank you for that. I haven't always been a Christian. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. In fact, I became a Christian September 28, 1973, which means today is my spiritual birthday. 52 years, and it ain't been easy. It's been challenging, but it's been reality. Now, I became a Christian at UCLA, but before that, I was at Michigan State University, and we used to come down to your neck of the woods during the spring and bring all our white skin down here and get burned off during spring break. And I used to encounter these Jesus people. This is before even the Jesus movement really started. They were just Jesus people, you know, and they annoyed the heck out of me because they're trying to mess up my week. I'm trying to enjoy myself being wild and crazy. And they're telling me about Jesus. And there was one particular thing that really, really bothered me about what they said. They said, you got to believe in Jesus because he's the only way of salvation. And I figured, what the heck? What about all these other religions? You know, and not that I particularly cared about any of those other religions because I didn't think they were true either. But I would raise that particular issue. And it was especially difficult for me because I thought the claim that your religious view, the Christians, was the only way of salvation was rather arrogant, rather uppity, a little bit intolerant, maybe bigoted, okay? And I hear the same kind of complaint now when Christians now 52 years later, including me, communicate the same message that offended me then. And I understand it completely from where you're coming from. I get it, all right? And frankly, it makes things awkward for me. So when I go onto a campus, I was in Kennesaw State just 3 weeks ago, Atlanta area, and if I'm making the case for Christianity and for Christ, it makes it harder for me to do that when I know that a lot of people who don't believe like I do are bugged at me because they're judging my character for the content of my convictions, all right? And I get it, but I think it's a mistake. And I want to talk about Jesus being the only way and why I think that's the smart money is on Jesus. But I want to dispatch a couple of, this particular complaint right away. I think there are things to consider that are hard to consider. But if you think that claiming Jesus is the only way is somehow a character flaw in the person who says that, I think you're letting something get in the way that doesn't need to be there. And so I want to try to clear that out and kind of dispatch that objection quickly. But I want to do it by offering an illustration. So let's just say you had a friend who was not feeling well and actually was feeling pretty bad and was worried about it and was going to go to the doctor but wanted some companionship, moral support. And so they brought you with. And the doctor examines your friend and comes up with the diagnosis that your friend has cancer. Bad. And he needs immediate treatment or else he will not survive the month. And you heard your friend say to the doctor who offered this diagnosis, "You're mean. I'm going to go find another doctor that's not so mean as you are." Now, my question is, if your friend did that, what would you think of your friend's response? First of all, you think it's a little bit weird because why would the doctor giving you a diagnosis that you don't like mean that he's mean? I mean, that doesn't seem to follow. And it's even worse than that because you probably think your friend was foolish because maybe the doctor's right. Maybe he is dying of cancer, and if he puts off dealing with it, he may die before he gets resolved, all right? He may find somebody that tells him a lie, and then he's going to suffer as a result, all right? You get the illustration I'm offering, very straightforward, all right? Now, I want to shift the illustration just a little bit. Let's say your friend comes to you, and let's say for the sake of discussion, you're a skeptic or maybe an atheist or somebody outside of Christianity. And maybe that's you here today. You might be a tire kicker, which is great. I'm glad you're here. I mean, I'm not going to try to convert you this morning. I hope I annoy you a little bit in a good way. Hope I put a stone in your shoe, so to speak. But just pretend that you're the person who goes to the Christian, and the Christian says, Jesus is the only antidote to the moral ailment that's killing you. The moral ailment is called sin, and he is the answer to that problem. And you respond to that person by saying, "You're mean." Now, of course, that's not the words you actually use, is it? You say, "You're intolerant, you're narrow-minded, you're bigoted," all right? I want you to notice something. If this is your impulse, you've changed the subject. The Christian was talking about Jesus and something he thinks is true about Jesus and humanity and Jesus' solution for humanity. And when you call this Christian those names, you switch the topic from the issue to the character of the Christian. Why did you do that? Now, I know why you did that. Because this is what everybody seems to do and think it's a reasonable response, but it's not. What if the Christian, when you say to the Christian who offers this information about Jesus that he's mean in some fashion, and what if the Christian responds, "Well, you're ugly, and your mom dresses you funny"? Now, you're chuckling because that would be a ridiculous response. It's irrelevant, right? And it's unkind, because it doesn't deal with the issue. But how is the charge of intolerance or narrow-mindedness or bigotry any different? It is simple name-calling. That's all it is. And when you feel comfortable, and I'm not even challenging anybody's character here, I'm just saying that that's the way people respond. But when you do that, you shift. And now you're just like the person who talks to the doctor gives them the diagnosis. And they say, "You're mean." You're not dealing with the issue. Because gee, it might be possible that the Christian is actually accurate in the claim he's making. Even if you think they have some character flaw, it doesn't go to the truthfulness of the claim. And this is the question now. The question isn't whether it's unpleasant. The question isn't whether it's offensive. The question is whether it's true. That's the real issue. And so I want to address that here and take a couple of steps. Hopefully, I've removed a big blockade or a barrier that you are not going to be distracted if you have been. And even Christians get distracted by this. I can understand anybody, frankly, be offended in this kind of culture, in the sensibilities of our culture. Even Christians who hold this view do so kind of awkwardly because they don't understand. They don't understand that. And this will be the first point that I'm going to broach, a general point, that the idea of religious pluralism, the idea that all religions are equally valid routes to God, all roads lead to Rome, you hear phrases like that, all roads lead to the top of the mountain, whatever. This is just false. And I want to show you why it's false, all right? And it's not bigotry, it's math. We'll get to that in a moment, all right? I also want to show you, answer 2 specific questions, and those questions are, or make these points, and that is that Jesus himself verified his claim to be the only way of salvation. And then I want to tell you why. The reason why Jesus is the only way. And by the way, this is an area where many Christians are confused, all right? They believe it, but they're not sure why it's the case, and so they have a hard time making the case with challengers that Jesus is who he claimed to be. So let's talk about why religious pluralism is false. Now remember, religious pluralism is not just the idea that there are a lot of religious options that we have to choose from. It's that all of them are the same ultimately, and they're each is just as good as anyone else. And this is why when a Christian says, well, my way is the right way and not the other ways, that people think that's arrogant, narrow-minded, and intolerant, all right? So I want to show you why this is false. And the best way to illustrate it is to tell you about a TV program that I was on in Toronto, Canada, a number of years ago. And the program is called The Test of Faith. And this was not a Christian program. It was a religious format, but it was a secular. And what they would do is they'd have a semicircle table. They have 1 chair here and 4 chairs out there. And they would get some religious weirdo to come in and sit down in the hot seat. And then Valerie Pringle, who was the host, would interview that person a little bit on this weird issue, whatever. And then they'd bring out other people to oppose that person over the course of an hour, okay? So that was entertainment, I guess, for Canadians. In any event, guess where Mr. Koukl was sitting in that particular episode? I was the weirdo in the hot seat, okay? So what was my weird view? I rejected religious pluralism. I did not think that all religions lead to God. The others are going to take the opposite side, right? Now, when you have a thing like this, generally, you have an interview beforehand. They want to find out if you're weird enough, right? So one of their staff called me. His name was Pierre, and he called me in my office in Los Angeles, and we had the interview, and after about a half hour, 40 minutes, we had a great conversation, and he figured, yeah, Koukl's weird enough. We're going to fly him out to Toronto, all right? When I got to the set, though, I got a chance to actually meet Pierre. And we were talking, off stage a little bit, and we had talked on the phone, so we kind of knew each other a little bit. And he's an atheist, which was fine. We had good conversation. But I did make a prediction. I said, Pierre, let me tell you how I think this is going to go. I'm going to give an argument against pluralism. And the people on the panel are not going to engage my argument, not my reasons against religious pluralism. They're going to begin attacking me, and they're going to call me things like bigoted and narrow-minded and intolerant, that kind of stuff. I said, I don't know, maybe it won't happen, but I'm just my gentleman's wager, right? Okay. So when the cameras start rolling, it's just me and Valerie Pringle. It's the very first segment. And she wants to know why I reject pluralism. Now, just so you know, I had a particular strategy in this interview, in this show. My strategy was not to argue for Christianity. And the reason I didn't want to do that, I could have said Christianity is true, Jesus rose from the dead, therefore, by process of elimination, other religions are false. I think that's a noble way to argue, but I didn't want to make Christianity the issue and have everybody attacking. I just wanted people to think about the issue of religious pluralism. I wanted to stay on track with the topic. And so what I said to her is, here's the reasons why I'm not a pluralist. I don't believe that every religion is true. And maybe my religion isn't true. I mean, that's possible. They can all be false, but they can't all be true. Here's why. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Now, either he was the Messiah or he wasn't the Messiah. And by the way, if Jesus never existed, then he wasn't the Messiah, right? So you only have 2 options. If he wasn't the Messiah, then the Jews are right and the Christians are wrong. If he was the Messiah, the Christians are right and the Jews are wrong, but under no circumstance can they both be right. You with me on that? All right. So I said, what about God? Maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't, might be an open question, but if he does, he's either a personal God or not. He's impersonal. Now, if God turns out to be personal, then the Jews and the Christians and Muslims are correct on that point, and the Hindus are wrong. If it turns out that God is not personal but impersonal, the Hindus are right, and the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims are wrong on that point. But under no circumstances can they both be correct. Are you with me here? When you die, I don't know, maybe you go to heaven or hell, maybe you get reincarnated, maybe you lie in the grave, but you can't do them all at the same time. Somebody's mistaken. Maybe everybody's mistaken. But they can't all be right, okay? So there was my argument. Now, we go to break, and then the first person out is the Sikh, Tishar Singh. He was a barrister there in Toronto, an attorney, very nice to me in the green room, but he comes out, well, the first thing he says is, after Valerie Pringle asked him, what do you think of Mr. Koukl's point of view? He says this, he says, if Mr. Koukl thinks he won the lottery, good for him. And I'm thinking, what? What's he talking about? Well, I'll tell you what had happened. He had gone to our website, Stand to Reason's website, str.org. Oh, I did that a little too fast. str.org. And he had downloaded some material to find out what my own particular convictions were. And he realized we're evangelical Christians, and we believe what Jesus said, that he's the only way of salvation. And so that's what prompted the comment, oh, if Mr. Koukl thinks he won the lottery, good for him. So it's like a little bit passive aggressive, but he didn't stay passive for long. He starts getting really angry at me. And he said, you're the kind of people that start wars, because I had this view, you know. Here's what's interesting. He was getting so animated that Valerie Pringle had to get up, push him down in his chair. And she had to put her hand on him because he's so coming across the table at me. This is the tolerant, even-handed, loving, pluralistic person, right? And by the way, you see this kind of thing all the time. The people who believe all ways are right, and we ought to be kind and loving and non-judgmental, are the ones that turn out to be the most judgmental and angry and hostile and, yes, even hateful in their behavior towards Christians. By the way, I'm not whining and crying, I'm just observing. Jesus told us to expect this. It's in the Beatitudes. Remember, blessed, blessed, blessed. Oh, that's so nice. And blessed are those who persecute you and say bad things about you for my name's sake. That's there too, all right? Why is that blessed? Because great is your reward in heaven, all right? So this is the kind of response that we get on a regular basis. And here he is hammering me with this. And then the Hindu pastor came out, and he was nicer. He still had the pluralistic view. All religions lead to God. Now, just to be clear, though, Hinduism actually teaches that all religions lead to Hinduism, you know, just to be clear on that particular point. Then they had a female pastor of the United Church of Canada, and she was out there hammering away at me too. So all three of these people are beating up on me. What's interesting is the change in the conversation that happened. Because before too long, you start hearing these words like arrogant, narrow-minded, intolerant. Are they responding to my argument? No, they're fulfilling my prophecy. And in fact, I even pointed that out at one point. I said, you know, it's interesting that the conversation has taken a shift. We were talking about whether religious pluralism was true or not, and now it's got shipped to Mr. Koukl's character, Mr. Koukl's personality. Mr. Koukl's this, he's that, he's the other thing. So Mr. Koukl is mean, I guess is what you're saying. How about this? How about if I just agree with you all that I'm mean? I'm all those things you say, I'm all these characters. Okay, I agree with you. Now that we're all in agreement that I'm a bad person, can we get back to the issue that we're, supposed to be discussing here today, pluralism, right? I said, and by the way, your challenge on me right now is really basically saying my view is false. In other words, the religious view that I hold, that I'm representing here, indirectly, because like I said, I wasn't trying to argue for Christianity, but they made that the issue. You think I'm wrong. In other words, my view is false, therefore, at least my version of Christianity is not sound, which is curious, because if I'm wrong in my religious view, then it isn't the case that all religious views are equally right. Therefore, if you're right in the way you're attacking me right now, then you're wrong in what we're supposed to be talking about here today. They didn't get it. One whole hour of conference, they didn't get it. I'll tell you who got it. The atheist got it. And after the camera stopped at the end of the show, he bounds up on the stage and he's really mad at the Sikh. And he's using language, appropriate for an atheist to express his anger, Pluralism is false. And there is the argument I just gave you. You can use it with your friends. Ask the same questions, make the same points. Different religions compete with each other in the basic issues. That Jesus is Messiah or not is central to Christianity, and that he's not is central to Judaism. We're not talking about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. Whether God is personal or impersonal, that's central to the nature of the whole project. They can't all be right. It's not bigotry. It's simple math. Okay, now having hopefully dealt with that issue, I want to talk about Jesus. And I want to make an observation about Jesus that is not particularly profound. Everybody likes Jesus. You'll almost never hear anybody complaining about Jesus. In fact, what you see is people trying to get Jesus on their team. And that's why people will say, well, listen, Christian, Jesus never said anything about homosexuality. Jesus never said anything about transgender. Jesus never said anything about abortion. So there. Okay, now what's their argument? They're saying if Jesus never said anything about those things, then you should never say anything about those things. Now, it turns out not to be a good argument. I'm not going to go there right now, but I just wanted to notice the trend, the tendency to think well of Jesus and to want to get Jesus on your side of the argument. That's because people have a very, very high view of Jesus. Okay, I wish that the people who do have a high view of Jesus, and they ought to, I wish they would just look at what Jesus said. Read Jesus. Don't read some cherry-picking verses. Read Jesus. Start at the beginning, go to the end. You take any gospel and just read the red lines if that's what you're interested in, and you'll finish in half an hour. Let Jesus speak for himself, because when you do that, you're going to discover something very important about Jesus of Nazareth. It was the identity of Jesus that mattered to Jesus more than anything else. He did not preach about, how to live. He did say some things about it, but almost everything that he said regarding that issue had already been said by the Hebrew prophets. That is not why he came. He didn't come to help us all get along. He didn't come to spread peace and love, and he didn't come to establish social justice. And I can't say anything about this just to make this point, but I wrote a piece called The Legend of Jesus, the Social Justice Warrior, all right? The Legend of Jesus, the Social Justice Warrior. It's on our website, str.org. I mentioned that already. I make the case from what Jesus claimed. That wasn't why he came. He did not campaign for the poor, that is the financially poor. He campaigned for the poor in spirit. He had a totally different mission, and all of his statements make that very clear. But at the center of everything that he said about why he came was himself. So you can take Buddha out of Buddhism and you still have Buddhism. You can take Muhammad out of Islam and you still have Islam. You take Christ out of Christianity, you have no Christianity. Because he is the source, the center, the substance of Christianity. And without him, Christianity doesn't exist. In fact, at Jesus' trial, he was executed not for what he did. They tried to find testimony against him. They couldn't get anybody to agree on bad things he did because he didn't do bad things. They finally got him when the high priest said, all right, are you the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God? And Jesus said, you have said it yourself. And he tore his robes, indicating that there was a blasphemy taking place. Now, was it blasphemy to claim that you're the Messiah? No, they were expecting a Messiah. This Messiah was claiming to be God himself come down, Emmanuel, God with us. That was off the charts. And that's why Jesus was executed. Jesus was executed for who he claimed to be, not for anything that he did. And this is why he, towards the end of his ministry, he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And there were various responses, because there are various responses. And then he asked them the most important question you could ever answer. Jesus asked them, who do you say that I am? And Peter, speaking for them, says, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus said, you got it. By the way, you didn't do that on your own. God helped you. The Father helped you with that one. Okay, that's the right answer, all right? And when you look then at the claims that Jesus made about himself, one particular point stands out. Now, it's characterized very powerfully at the end of his work in what's called the Upper Room Discourse. It's the final discourse that Jesus gave, John chapter 13 to 17. But that's where in John chapter 14, Jesus says, now listen to the words carefully. Many of you know this verse. Sometimes we say it too fast and we miss the impact of some of these passages. Here's what he said. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. That's pretty powerful. But that isn't the only time he said it. That's at the end of his ministry. All throughout his work, he's stating the same thing in different ways. Unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins, for example. And not only did he say this, but every single one of his disciples that followed after him, the people that he personally trained to take his message after him, they said the same thing. Look at Acts chapter 4. And there you've got Peter. Now, Peter, after Jesus was crucified, remember, he's the first one to deny Christ. Then he skedaddles off. The rest of the disciples scatter, right? And then they're behind locked doors, lights out, knees banging together because they don't want to suffer the same fate that Jesus did. And then a week later, there they out in the streets preaching about Jesus, the same one that, as Peter says, this Jesus whom you've crucified, God has made him both Lord and Christ. How do we know? Because God raised him from the dead, and we are witnesses to that. And then what does he say in chapter 4? There is salvation in none other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Look at Paul in Romans chapter 10. Now, Paul was late coming to the party, wasn't he? Because he was a persecutor of the church until Jesus appeared to him and then transformed his life. And he ended up giving his life, being beheaded there outside of Rome under the Neronian persecution for the cause of Christ. And he writes in Romans chapter 10, talking about the Jews that he loved, he was trying to reach. I bear them witness, he says, they have a zeal for God. But it's not according to knowledge. They're sincere, but they're getting it wrong. For not knowing about God's sense of righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness for all those who believe. And if you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, then you will be saved. This is the message throughout. They are repeating the message that Jesus entrusted to them. And in fact, towards the end of his ministry, we see this verse that I mentioned, but that wasn't just at the end. At the very beginning of it, that was the Upper Room Discourse. That was the fourth main discourse. The first one was the Sermon on the Mount. And what did Jesus say right at the outset? Enter by the narrow gate. Enter by the narrow gate. For the gate's wide, and the way's broad that leads to destruction, and many are those who enter by it. But the gate is small, and the way is narrow that leads to life, and few are those who find it. Jesus, this one that everybody respects to a person, was not a pluralist. He said, all that came before me are thieves and robbers. That's John 10. But I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. My sheep know me, they follow me, and I give them eternal life. Jesus, the only way. Now, here's the question I want to offer, given that the historical record, and by the way, I'm citing out of the primary source historical documents for the life of Jesus. Why does he talk that way? Because this is the way historians treat Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You want to find out about some ancient somebody doing something, you go back to the original things that were written to him, about him, and those are called the primary source historical documents. And when historians write about the life of Jesus, where do they get their information? They get it from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When people offer their opinion about who Jesus is, and like I said, most people like Jesus, where are they getting their information from? There are 17 other sources outside of Scripture that talk about Jesus. So we have verification, if you will, corroboration from other sources. But that isn't a lot of information. It's just verifying what we find in a robust sense in those 4 accounts of Jesus' life, which give tremendous detail and corroborate each other. That's what historians are looking for. And they have embarrassing details in them. I mean, the disciples don't look particularly good, do they, in these accounts? Nobody's going to make up an account where they look bad, you know? It's just not the way it's done. So there are very good reasons why historians take these things seriously. By the way, there's another observation. I mentioned that everybody likes Jesus because they read or know something about Jesus that they like. Isn't it odd for some of these people who like Jesus for what they think are good reasons? Maybe Jesus is a peace and love Jesus. Maybe he's a social warrior or what, a social justice warrior or whatever. But then they push back on the Gospels. You can't trust those. Those are written by Christians. They're not reliable, or give some reason. All right, well, maybe they're not reliable. But if they're not reliable, then you can't pick verses you like as if those individual verses are reliable about Jesus for you to have an alternate view of who Jesus was. Either you have a good historical source or you don't. If you don't, there is no Jesus left for you to have an opinion about. You get my point. But this happens all the time. So I'm citing these accounts because these are the accounts that historians use to reconstruct the life of Jesus, all right? Now, they don't all agree with everything. It is curious, though, that they accept the non-supernatural stuff is largely reliable. When it comes to the supernatural stuff, they don't like that. Now the question is, why would they reject the supernatural stuff when the rest of the stuff they think is reliable? Well, that's a question you can ask them. It seems to be an inconsistency. I'm not dealing with supernatural stuff here. I'm just dealing with things that Jesus said about himself, all right? And pretty dramatic things that he said about himself. Okay, so now here's the question. Was he right? Or was he wrong? Now, this is actually easy to resolve in my mind, and I'm going to employ an ancient argument here that's shown up more recent times in different forms, all right? But it seems to me you have a very few choices. Either Jesus was right or he was wrong. That's easy. If he's right, he's the Lord of God, of creation. Bow down, worship him, trust in him. Maybe he wasn't right, though. Now, if he wasn't right, you have 2 options. He either was wrong and he knew he was wrong when he made these radical claims, or he was wrong and he didn't know he was wrong, all right? So let's just think of those 2 options. If Jesus was wrong and knew he was wrong, this means that he is making a proclamation about his identity that he knows is false. And he is calling multitudes to follow him to the death. In Matthew 10, Jesus warns his disciples, so he's sending out on a short-term mission, and he says, you're about to encounter problems, difficulty, hardship. You're going to be dragged before magistrates. You're going to be whipped. Some of you are going to be killed. But never mind. Don't fear him who can kill the body and not the soul. Fear rather him who can throw body and soul in hell. It's pretty stern, right? Matthew 10, read it yourself. Pretty stern warning and admonition to obey Jesus and follow him even to the point of death. Pretty radical if Jesus is lying. If he knows this isn't true, then he is among the most evil people for saying all of these things that are true about him and they're not. If he knew they were not. If he was a liar. He was also an idiot because he played out this charade to the bitter end, right? Now, here's the deal about lying. And this is your basic rule for lying. And every schoolboy knows this rule, all right? If you're gonna tell a lie that gets you something good. Don't tell a lie that gets you beaten, whipped, and crucified. This is not a good lie. But this is exactly what Jesus faced. So, was he lying? That makes no sense. Well, that's the other alternative. He was wrong, and he didn't know he was wrong. He actually thought all of those claims that he made about himself were true. He was the bread of life, and if you eat of him, as it were, you would never die. He was the living water. He was the resurrection and the light. He was the great I am. He was the Alpha and the Omega, all these exalted things that he claimed about himself. What if they weren't true? Yet he still believed they were. I mean, if any of us were to make the kinds of claims that Jesus made, it would be laughable. No one would take us seriously. But when those men were sent, the soldiers, initially to arrest Jesus, and they came back empty-handed, they said, "Where's Jesus?" He said, "No man speaks as this man speaks." He was riveting because the dramatic things he was saying. Are these the words of a crazy man? Because you'd have to be crazy to believe all of those things about yourself, certifiable, if you believed all those things and they weren't true. So maybe Jesus he wasn't a liar, he was just nuts. Let me ask you, does that make sense of the historical record? Do we get the sense that Jesus is continually moving away from reality? No, he moved towards reality. He was completely nonplussed in the most difficult circumstances, even when he was being tried and then executed. This is the man who prays for his executioners, saying, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Is this a crazy person? Now, that doesn't make sense either. Hey, if Jesus was crazy, what does that say about us? That doesn't make sense. Not of the record. Okay, so Jesus wasn't a liar. That doesn't make sense. He wasn't crazy. That doesn't make sense. Therefore, he wasn't wrong. And I think this argument is called aut deus, aut homo malus. In Latin, means either God or a bad man. There was no in between. And C.S. Lewis, I think, states it best when he says either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit on him and kill him as a demon. You can fall on your feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any of this patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Well put. But why? Why is he the only way? We have every reason to believe from the record that he believed this himself, that his identity was a central feature of his whole enterprise, that he wasn't lying and he wasn't crazy. He was who he claimed to be. But why does it have to be this way? I want you to think about crucifixion for a moment. It's a brutal form of punishment perfected by the Romans. A person who dies of crucifixion doesn't die usually of bloodshed or stress. They die of suffocation. In other words, they're hanging from the cross, and they can only breathe by pushing against the nails in their feet and pulling against the nails that are actually in their wrists. Back then, they considered that part of the hand. That held them up, and they would be able to get a breath. And then when they got a breath, they'd collapse down again, and then they had to keep doing that to keep breathing. And pretty soon they'd wear themselves out, and they'd collapse, and then they wouldn't be able to breathe, and they would suffocate. Crucifixion. That's why they broke the legs of the thieves, because they weren't dead yet. They break the legs, they're going to suffocate just like that. Okay? That's what Jesus suffered. But there's a deeper torment that couldn't be seen. A greater anguish, far greater than the pain of the cross that was inflicted by human beings. More dreadful than the lashes that ripped his flesh from his bones, more painful, excruciating than the nails that pinned his body to the cross. It was a dark and terrible and incalculable agony as God the Father unleashed his fury upon his sinless Son. So why punish the innocent one? On the cross at the top was a thing called a titulus. It's a record of the crime that was committed. It said King of the Jews. So sedition was the reason that he was being crucified. It was a debt to Caesar, as it were. And when debts were formulated in the ancient Near East, like someone owed something else to someone else, it was on a certificate. And when the debt was paid off, they would write a word across the face of it. And the word was the Greek word tetelestai. And all that meant was paid. It's like canceling a check, okay? But being King of the Jews wasn't the crime that Jesus actually paid for, because there was another certificate of debt that Paul in Colossians says that Jesus had nailed to his cross. And he's speaking of the list of crimes that are recorded in the book. If you go to the end of the story, Revelation 20, the great judgment, there's books that are open. And one of the set of books, there is the book of life, but the other one is not called the book of death, but that's what it amounts to, because it lists all of the crimes of everyone who has ever lived, you too. Every bad thing you have ever done, God's made a record of. Jesus said every careless thought, word that you speak, you will give an account of on the day of judgment. That's our rap sheet. And if you look closely, that is the basis upon which people are judged. Everyone was judged according to their deeds. And if their name was not found written in the book of life, they are tossed in the lake of fire as punishment for their misdeeds. Now keep that picture in mind, this rap sheet, because that's the rap sheet that Paul says was nailed to Jesus' cross. Decrees which were against us, Paul says, Jesus paid for them. And in the darkness that shrouds Calvary, from the 6th to the 9th hour, a divine transaction is taking place. Jesus is making a trade with the Father. And the crimes of all humanity, I mean every murder and every theft and every lustful glance and every hidden act of vice, every crime of every man who ever lived, Jesus takes upon himself as if he were the guilty party. And in the end, when just before he delivers his spirit to the Father in death, a single Greek word escapes his lips. Tetelestai. Now, your Bible's translated, it is finished, but Jesus wasn't saying, I'm glad that's over with. He was saying, the debt is paid for. It's canceled out. I've done the job I came to do. Forgiveness is now possible for anyone who would receive the gift. The divine transaction is complete. And in that transaction, he gets our badness, we get his goodness. The text says in 2 Corinthians 5, he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. And this, my friends, is why Jesus is the only way. He is the only one who solved the problem. Nobody else ever did this. Nobody ever could. Only the divine Son of God could take the punishment that is due each of us to give us liberty and freedom and forgiveness. Either Jesus pays or we pay. Either Jesus pays or we pay. That is the divine calculus. And if you're still a little uncertain about this, I want you to think of Jesus in Gethsemane. Because there in Gethsemane, and if you watch the film, the Passion of the Christ, which is worth watching. I mean, it's all in Aramaic, so you're not going to understand the words, but you know the story, and you can follow what's going on. Actually, I think they have subtext. But there they have a magnificent scene of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. agonizing about what is about to follow. And he's pleading with the Father after a fashion, Father, if there's any other way, if there's any other route, if there's any other manner that people can be rescued, I don't want to do this. I don't have to do this. And in that scene that you see, so wonderfully directed by Mel Gibson, that Jesus falls to his knees, overwhelmed with the agony of the thought of what's about to come. And he surrenders himself to the Father, not my will, but thine be done. Why? Because there was no other way. When I lectured at the University of California in Berkeley, also known as Berkeley, I had a full audience. I talked about in the overflow rooms. It was a massive turnout. And I was talking about moral relativism. It was like a philosophical lecture, about why the idea that morals are just a matter of our own make-me-up. This is false. There is objective morality. We all know this, partly because we all complain about the problem of evil. Out there in the world, we know that morality is real. And we know that we have violated that morality. And this is what I got to at the end. I said, there's something I know about everybody in this audience that you know about yourself, but you try to keep from other people, but I know. And what's that? You all have a bad self-image. How do I know that? Because everybody does. We look down inside of ourselves, we see something we don't like that's ugly and it's broken, and the thing that's ugly and broken is moral. There's something bad in there. And we have a feeling about the badness inside of us, and the feeling about our own badness has a name to it. In English, I asked them, what is the word that we use to describe the badness that we know that's inside of us? And I just waited. And then I would hear this from other parts of the audience. I hear the word guilt, guilt, guilt. I said, yeah, you're right. We feel guilty. Why? Is what I asked them. Well, maybe culture causes that. We can talk about that. But how about this? Maybe we feel guilty because we are guilty. Is that in the running? And if we are guilty, the answer to guilt is not denial. That's relativism. The answer, I told them, to guilt is forgiveness. And this, I said, is where Jesus comes in. Now, that was the end of my lecture. By the way, that was the first time I mentioned anything spiritual, religious. First time I mentioned Jesus. Then I said, if you want to know how that works, you got to come back tomorrow night, because the next night, Saturday night, is when I gave this talk, why Jesus is the only way. But I want you to let that thought sink in there. The answer to guilt is forgiveness. And if you are a skeptic here, tire kicker, whatever you are, and you have not dealt with this guilt, which is real and you know it, you're not going to find any other solution to it, because you are guilty before someone. It's not about forgiving yourself. You haven't offended yourself with what you've done wrong. In many cases, you've liked it. You've offended God. And it's God who you will stand before and give an account when those books are opened. And there is only one solution to that. Either Jesus pays or you pay. Perfect justice or perfect mercy. That's what you're facing right now. And if you've never resolved this, maybe you want to chew on those things that I said here, maybe I annoyed you a bit, and that's okay. You need to resolve it, because there's only one solution. It's just like your buddy who goes to the doctor and says you're dying of cancer. You better deal with it, because one of these days it's going to get you. By the way, if you're a follower of Christ, I want to encourage you, because if Jesus paid for your sins, you don't pay for your sins ever, anyway, anyhow. Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God. That's not the peace of God. That's something else. We have peace with God, and that means God's not mad at us anymore. There's no battle going on between us. We have been reconciled through Jesus, through whom we have received our introduction into this faith in which we stand. And Paul finally says right after that, and we exult and rejoice because of what God has done on our behalf through Jesus. Last thought. People say, well, I want to worship God my way. okay? But it doesn't matter if you worship God your way. It doesn't. It only matters if you worship God God's way. God's way is Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, who came down to do something incredible for you, to rescue you from the crimes that you've committed against God. Who will hold you responsible if you don't resolve this with him? Father, thank you for this great time I've had with these fine people here. So glad to be able to relate these facts and to be reminded of your goodness and your kindness and your mercy to me. 52 years running now. It's been a wild ride, but thank you. Thank you.